months ago when we were going to host this. When we're going to host this at your E&D evening. So we're just doing it online now. And basically what we're going to be doing is just run through a fairly straightforward basic raw processing workflow with each of the images. And the idea is just to kind of give you a general set of pointers about how we go about processing a raw image. The images we're going to be looking at aren't particularly challenging images to process, and I think that's, there are difficult problems to solve, but one of the issues we sometimes encounter with images like that is you generally don't know where to start. If you have an image where there's an obvious fault that needs to be fixed, it can be a little bit easier just to get going. Whereas if you've got an image that kind of looks fairly decent to start off with, it can leave you a little bit in the dark in terms of where you start. So I'm going to just go ahead and I've just got to share the screen and just keep it. Right, share. All right, okay, so Zoom protocol at this point dictates that I ask if everyone can see my screen.
Well, I can certainly, so I'm assuming others can.
All right, okay, cool. So this is the selection of images that we've got. I'm gonna just start at the top and work my way down through the whole selection. So you'll note that they've already been imported. And we're not going to be really going through a complete raw workflow. So we're not doing imports and renames and keywords and all those sorts of things. We're going to mostly just be focusing on the actual processing of the images, the adjustments and the making pretty end of things. So I'm going to just start with this very first image over here. We're going to pop straight over into the develop module. And in there, we can now kind of get a better sense of what the image looks like. The first thing I like to do when I'm working with a raw image is I just minimize the left-hand panel where the presets and all those sorts of things are, the history, because it allows me to see the image bigger on my screen. I've got a clearer sense of what's going on. I will typically, by this point, I will already have checked sharpness. I already have selected this image out of, if I had done a bracketed sequence or something, so that this would be pretty much set as the image that I want to work with. Generally speaking, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take my right-hand panel where all my sliders are, and I'm going to make the actual panel quite a bit wider. And the reason I do that is because it gives me a little bit of extra sensitivity in how I move the sliders. If the slider is very short, it tends to act very abruptly. Whereas if I make it a bit longer, I can be a little bit more subtle. So just to kind of find my feet with the image, just to kind of get a sense of what is possible with this image, I'm going to just start off with my exposure slider. I'm going to pull it way over to the left and see what sort of detail is available in the clouds. You'll see we've got an area over here that's completely blown out, so I'm not going to try to recover that. And then if I push it over to the right, you'll see we've got actually relatively bright, open sort of shadow detail. So we don't really have to worry too much about what's spotting with the shadow detail. There should be enough for us to recover and give it a nice, rich sort of shadow tonality. For those of you who are familiar with the Lightroom interface, I'm going to start fairly basic. So for some of you, it might be old news. But generally speaking, the way that this interface is set up is we're supposed to, or the software engineers want us to work from the top to the bottom. So we would select a profile, adjust the white balance, do the tonality adjustment, do the presence adjustment, and then work our way down through the rest of the stuff that they give us to work with. And generally speaking, it's a fairly good way to work. It mostly gets you to the result that you want. You will most often find yourself jumping back and forth a little bit, but that's pretty much to be expected. So what I'm going to do with regard to the profile, I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, but I'm not actually going to set a different profile from the Adobe default. So when we open up the profile picker like so, and I've just gone and clicked on this little set of blocks over here that opens the profile picker. And basically each one of these profiles will give us a different starting point for the image. It doesn't apply any adjustments. It is simply interpreting the raw data that has come in from the camera in a different sort of way. It is when it does the demosaicing, where it assigns all the color values to each pixel, it's doing that in a slightly different way to give us a different sort of effect. So for instance, if we look at Adobe RAW here, you'll see we have a color and a monochrome and a landscape. And you'll see as I hover my mouse over them, the tonality and the color of the image changes a little bit as I go along. And then all of the profiles that you have built into your camera will be there as well. So if you set a particular color mode on your camera, a black and white mode or a vivid or a landscape or a portrait, and those will be present here as well. And again, you'll see those pop up like so. And then we've got a whole bunch of extra ones at the bottom here, artistic and black and white and all sorts of things. The reason I am starting and sticking with the Adobe Color profile, I generally work with Adobe Color with the Adobe Color or with Adobe Standard, and you'll see they look almost indistinguishable for this image. The reason I stick to them is because they are very flat profiles. And the reason I like a very flat profile is it gives me a lot more headroom when I start making adjustments. It's very unlikely that I'm going to end up doing something that causes the image quality to deteriorate if I'm starting with a nice flat profile. It also means that it's easier to maintain good highlight and shadow detail if the profile is fairly flat to start off with. So we're just going to start right there. White balance in this case, I think probably looks okay. I'm going to nudge it a little bit warmer because I'm trying to pick out a little bit of this yellow that's in the cloud. I don't want to go so warm that we lose the blue. So if you pay attention to this corner up here, as I go over to the right, if that sort of starts losing its bluish color, the yellows look beautiful, but I've lost the blue. So I don't want to go that far. So I'm going to back off a little bit just so I can still see some of the blues over there and not over adjust. I'm going to leave the tint alone in this instance. Now, from this point onward, when I'm dealing with the tone adjustments, I'm going to be kind of looking at the general things first. Generally, what does the exposure look like? And generally, what does the contrast look like? I think generally the exposure, because of this very prominent sky, the exposure looks a little on the bright side. So I'm going to pull back ever so slightly on exposure. You'll see it does compromise the foreground a little bit, but that's a specific thing which we can get to later. We're just concerned about general stuff for the moment. And then contrast, we're going to just nudge it a bit over to the one side and nudge it a bit back to the other side and just see what it does. In this case, I think pushing the contrast up actually has quite a nice effect. It brings out the texture and the clouds beautifully, and it gives a lot more depth to that upper 2/3 of the image. So we're going to just go a bit more contrast over there. Again, the foreground is going very, very dark, but we'll get to that. That's a specific problem. Now we're starting to work a bit more specifically, highlights. We can see the highlights, especially over in this sort of area. We are very, very bright. So I'm going to pull back. And mostly what I'm looking for is if I go too far, so this is too far, then it makes a very abrupt transition over here between areas that do have detail and areas that don't have detail. And I want to try to avoid that. So I'm going to back off on this until that transition's really subtle. You can see now there's a very subtle transition between detail and no detail. That's much nicer. Then shadows. This is now where we can start tweaking what's going on with this foreground area over here. I'm going to push the shadows up a little bit. And I just want to see a nice bit of luminosity come into these shadow tones. I want to be able to distinguish between the different colors over there. And I want it not to be so dark that it becomes kind of heavy looking. Again, we could go a lot further, but then it just goes back to being flat and kind of poorly executed HDR look. So I'm going to just push it just to there. In this case, I'm going to over adjust the shadows very slightly because I'm going to use the black slider later to add a bit of contrast back. And the white slider over here, I find the way that I process, I tend to prefer a fairly natural looking process. I tend almost always to adjust whites opposite to shadows. or whites rather, opposite to highlights, sorry. So if the highlights have gone left, the whites go right a slight bit. And the reason for that is in the front, in the right-hand kind of third of the histogram, when I pull the highlights to the left, that you'll see what happens is that histogram kind of bunches. And what that does is it makes the lighter tones quite flat. So by pushing the whites over to the right a tiny bit, it brings the contrast back. And similarly for the left-hand half of the histogram, I'm going to pull the blacks down a touch, and you'll see how beautifully it brings contrast back into the foreground. The foreground still maintains all the heat, but we get quite a bit more contrast coming out of there. Okay, and we're just going to do a kind of a before and after at this stage. That's how far we've come. My process on the right and the original on the left. So I tend to go back and forth between my process and the original very often. And the reason for that is it's kind of a nice way to check if you're overcooking things or not. In this case, I do think the image is looking a little too yellow, but I have a plan for that. We're going to adjust the sky separately just to get a bit more blue back. But I do think based on what I'm seeing here, I am going to just back off and allow the image to go slightly colder, just over there. So this white balance is now a little bit closer to the original. It's still warm, but not as warm as it was before. Right, with regard to presence, this is the part of the Lightroom processing interface where people often get just a little bit too carried away. So, and if you push these things too far, your image starts looking incredibly artificial. In some cases, that's perfectly fine. In some cases, that's what you want. But I think for a sort of a softer, natural kind of looking landscape like this one, we do want to treat it carefully. So I'm going to leave texture alone completely. I'm going to give it just a hint of clarity, maybe 10, 15 points, and you'll see it's bringing a nice bit of detail into the sky there. So if I push it up to maybe 15, 20 points, we get a little bit of extra texture coming into the sky. You'll see if I take it too far, it looks really rather gritty. We don't want that. We just want a bit of extra texture. And then vibrance and saturation, I think in this case, we don't really need to do much with them. I am going to just give it a touch of extra vibrance, and you'll see that lifts these beautiful yellows we've got along the bottom here. It lifts them quite nicely. Now at this stage one, you'll see, again, if we go back there, the image has shifted a little bit in its rendition. So what we're going to do now, the next thing I want to do is I want to work on the balance of the image. And with that, I mean, there's two different things we need to do. I need to sort out a bit of cropping, and then I need to adjust the tonal balance so that there's a nice transition between the sky and the foreground, and there isn't too much of a difference between them, so that the image appears bottom heavy. As it is now, the image appears a little bit bottom heavy because the bottom's quite dark, and it also appears heavier on the right than on the left, because the right-hand side of the image is actually quite a lot darker than the left. So I'm going to start off with a crop. I'm going to not constrain the crop, and I'm just going to make the image a little narrower. Just crop off the road, rotate it ever so slightly because the horizon's a touch skew. There we go, and confirm that crop. Okay, I quite like the skinny format for this one. Now in terms of adjusting kind of the balance left to right and top to bottom, I'm going to use two gradient filters. I'm going to start off with a gradient running all the way right from the edge of the image at the top, pretty much down to the horizon. The reason I make the gradient very long is because then its effect is really subtle. And I'm just simply going to go and pull back on exposure a little bit. You'll see it gives the image quite a dramatic sort of rendition. And then I'm going to create another gradient running left to right to pull back on the side a little bit. Now that side one, you'll see it's bringing that kind of unnatural gradation over there back, so I do want to be a bit more subtle with it. So I'm not going to use only exposure, I'm going to use highlights as well, and perhaps pull the contrast down a touch. So you'll see that's without gradients, and that's with gradients. The next thing I want to do is create an additional gradient. You'll see the line of the clouds runs, there's an angle that runs this way. I'm going to do an additional gradient that runs across that way. I'm not really going to adjust exposure with that one. I'm going to make it maybe just a hint darker, but I am going to shift the temperature a little bit colder because I want to use that complementary color, use the blues here to balance the oranges on the side. Reflecting back on it now, looking at this left-hand side here, I do think that transition there is still too obvious. So I'm going to just back off on my adjustment a bit, like so. And I think that sort of transition works better. And I'm going to just confirm those two adjustments. With regard to this image, I don't think there's a great deal more I would do to this image. I think it's a nice, gentle, soft sort of rendition. And you know, we could go into all of the other panels over here, but I think at this stage for an image like this one, I don't think there's a great deal more we can get out of it with our other adjustments here. I think we'll definitely move into those other adjustments for some of our other example images, but I think this one, if we look at our before and after view there, I think we've made quite a nice shift to the brightness and the color of the image, and I think it looks, yeah, I think that's quite a nice rendition of the image. Does anyone have any questions? Anything you'd like to ask or comment? No? Right, cool. Moving swiftly along. Right, our next image, beautiful lighthouse. So again, just bringing my panels back there, having a look at what we can see. I think with this image, just kind of glancing up at the histogram here and looking at the image itself, you'll see the histogram is very nicely spread all the way from the left-hand edge and then almost all the way across to the right-hand side. So we've got a really, really wide range of tones that we can work with. I'm noting that the ISO is at 1600 there, so I'm a little concerned about noise. So when I look there, we can see there's a noticeable amount of noise. We may want to go and fiddle with that a bit. Les, can you just give me an indication of whether people can see the noise over the screen share?
Yes, it's definitely, you can see it.
Okay, all right. The screen share resolution is sometimes a bit too low to see it. So
yeah, you can see it.
Okay, excellent. All right, so with this image again, what I'm going to do is, again, just work my way top to bottom. I'm not going to fiddle with the profile. What I do want to see is what the image looks like if I start with a neutral color balance. I don't think it's the best way to go, but I want to see what it looks like. So I'm going to use my white balance dropper and just pop it on the white of the building there itself, and you'll see it goes far, far warmer than it was. It's not, I suppose it's not as bad as I thought it might be. I thought it was going to just go luminous orange. But it is a little bit better than it was with the colder rendition where it started off. So I'm going to just back off slightly over to the blue side over there. And if you look there, you can see the image still retains a bit of blue at the top here. It's not completely kind of vibrant orange, but it does retain a nice bit of that warmth and has a little bit of the cooler tone still in there. With regard to exposure, I'm going to nudge the exposure up a little bit. And my reasoning there is kind of the bottom half of the image is relatively dark. And adjusting exposure tends to deal with shadow detail better than adjusting shadows. You get a more natural kind of tonality in the shadows. So I'm going to push that up a touch, and you'll see we get beautiful luminous detail out of the foreground when we do that. The contrast in the image, it's a touch on the flat side, so I'm going to push the contrast up a little bit. Then highlights down. You can see we can go quite a long way, and this one I think we can get away with pulling the highlights back quite a long way. I am concerned that the building goes a bit dark. So I don't want to go too far, but we'll see if there's a way around that in just a minute. Shadows, I am going to nudge the shadows a touch brighter. And then same as before, whites up a touch. Can you see in the sky? It just brings a lot of extra depth and contrast into the sky. Look at the top right of the histogram. You can see that histogram stretching more towards the edge of the range. Gives us a lot more vibrance and punch in the colors. And then blacks down a touch just to ground the foreground. I'm also going to give this one a hint of clarity. Just a touch. Just about there. That's a bit much. There we go. Okay, so if we look closely, you can see there aren't really any halos forming around anything, so that clarity adjustment's probably fine. And in this image, I'm not going to deal with vibrance and saturation here. I'm going to deal with the colors in the HSL panel in a minute. Then we're also going to, same as with our previous image, I'm going to put a gradient across the top and just pull the exposure back a touch, like so. You'll see it's darkening the top of the lighthouse a little bit. So I'm going to use the range mask option here. The range mask allows me to tell this gradient to ignore some tones. So I'm going to ask the gradient to ignore the darker tones of the lighthouse. I'm not sure if it'll work. There may not be a big enough difference between the lighthouse and the sky, but we'll see. So I'm going to switch it on and I'm going to set it to luminance. And then if I hold the Alt key, it'll show me the mask that it's using. So anything that's dark is not being adjusted. And you'll see as I move the slider over, see the lighthouse starts appearing again. And that means it's not going to adjust the lighthouse as much. It's, see, the sky's also coming back. So I'm starting to kind of encroach on that. The smoothness allows me to adjust where that transition happens. So I think just over here is probably pretty good. So that's without the gradient, and that's with it. It does make a difference to the brightness of the building, but I don't think it's so significant that we really need to worry about it too much. Maybe what we can do just to compensate is I can use the brush. I'm going to use the brush tool. I'm going to just zoom in a little less. There we go. So I'm going to switch the brush tool to auto mask. That means that the brush decides for itself where which things to include. It kind of it allows me to go over the edges, but the brush will not actually paint over the edges. So we're going to do that. You'll see the effect is very, very aggressive at the moment. We'll tone it down in a moment, but you'll see it's not going over the edges, which is why we use the auto mask function. There, it went over the edges a bit. I'll just undo. No, that also goes over the edges. Now, zoom back out and just give it a nudge of extra brightness there. So you see that's without the brush and with. So that undoes the darkening to the lighthouse that I created with the gradient. And I can now, what I'm also going to do, I can collapse this whole panel by clicking on that little triangle, and then I can adjust the overall effect. So I can see, just balance it out a little bit. So I just want to keep it really subtle. That's too subtle. There we go. Right, so that's that part of the image sorted. The next thing I want to do with this image is I think we are going to need to also do another very big general adjustment where I'm going to make a much longer gradient, one that runs the entire length of the image. And basically what I'm trying to do now is not deal with the sky like what I'm doing before, but dealing with the balance between the top half and the bottom half. And in this case, I just want to, actually I'm going to do it, I'm going to cancel that one, just press backspace to cancel it. I'm going to do the gradient the other way around. Like so, and just add a bit of exposure to the foreground. So you'll see what that one's doing. Now we've got dark foreground and bright sky, that's without. And with the two gradients, it balances the top half and the bottom half quite nicely. What we need to be super careful of is we never want the reflection to be brighter than the sky, because that's going to make it really, really obvious that we've been fiddling with things. And I think we're just skating right on the edge of that kind of rule of thumb at the moment. Okay, this image, I will benefit from a bit of fiddling with the tone curve. So with the tone curve here, I'm going to just give it a little bit of extra punch and a little bit of extra contrast. All of the adjustments we've done now have worked beautifully to balance the image, but it has left the image quite flat. So I'm going to just very carefully reintroduce a bit of contrast using the tone curve, like so. So you'll see that's what we've done thus far. Under HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance, I'm going to have a look at just the hue of the blues. The blues over here are quite cyan in color. So I'm going to just shift them over to a slightly purpler blue. There's very little separation between the oranges and the yellows. So I'm going to, and the pinks as well. So I'm going to take the magentas and the reds and shift them a little bit further over to kind of a pink purple color. And then the oranges and yellows, I'm going to shift over a little bit more towards yellow. And then under saturation, I'm going to push the blues a little bit, because these oranges and pinks are so vibrant, we need quite a strong blue color just to balance it so the whole image doesn't look pink. And again, that's without any color adjustments and with. It's not super, it's not a very aggressive adjustment. It's a nice subtle adjustment just to get those tones balancing and the colors balancing each other quite nicely. Now we get to noise. So when we deal with noise, we have to be zoomed in. I prefer to zoom into 1:1. And I'm going to pick an area of the image, like over here, where we've got some smooth tone like this. We've got some textured detail and some fine texture. And the reason we need all three of those is because each of them will be influenced differently by the way we deal with noise reduction. So when I get to detail here, under sharpening and noise reduction, the two tend to work against each other. And so any adjustments we make to the one, we often need to cancel out with adjustments to the other. In this case, I'm going to leave the sharpening on the default setting. And the reason for that is the default setting is tailored to your specific camera. Adobe writes a noise reduction or a sharpening profile for your camera, and it generally does a reasonably good job of the input sharpening of this end of your sharpening workflow. So I'm not going to adjust that, but I am going to tweak the noise reduction, and then based on what the noise reduction does, we may end up going back to sharpening again. So we're going to give it, you'll see I'm going to just do a really aggressive one just so we can see what happens. If I push the noise reduction way up, the noise is beautifully smoothed out, but so is most of the fine detail in the image, and that's not really what we want. So we need to be gentler with the noise reduction, and I'm going to push the detail slider up so that it preserves a bit more detail. You'll see that basically what it's doing is where the subject detail is quite smooth, it applies a heavier noise reduction, and where the subject is a little bit more filled with fine detail, it's a little bit less aggressive. So I want to try to preserve detail as much as I can. And then the contrast is just the micro contrast, that really, really fine contrast between the little noise specks. This image, I don't think really needs a color noise adjustment. If you look in this area over here, there's a slight unevenness to the color. So we can give it just a hint of extra color noise adjustment. And I think that's as far as I'd want to push it. I don't want to go any further than this, because we're going to start compromising the image sharpness too much. That's no noise reduction, so that switches the color noise off as well. And that's default sharpening plus noise reduction. Okay. And that I think looks reasonably good noise-wise. And the lens corrections, you'll see we've got a little bit of fringing over there. We've got a bit of pink on the edge of the railings. We've got a bit of cyan on the edge of that door frame. So I'm just going to switch on remove chromatic aberrations, and you'll see that color fringing just disappears completely. And I'm going to ask it to do an automatic profile correction. And that automatic profile correction, you'll see, just straightens out a little bit of pincushion distortion that this lens creates. I don't think that's essential in this case, but yeah, we'll keep it. And then lastly, just to make sure everything is nice and straight, we're going to use the guided transform, which allows me to define or to tell it which things I want straight. I'm going to just zoom in a little on the building. There we go. So I'd like the building straight, and I'm going to tell it I would like this side of the wall and this side of the wall to be perfectly upright and perfectly parallel to one another. And what it does is it applies whatever distortion is necessary to get the building straight. So you'll see there is without, and there is with. In this case, it doesn't actually, it actually looks more skew, which is I think is happening just because the building tapers off to the side as well. We can try to straighten it side to side and see if that helps. And if it doesn't, we can just cancel that adjustment. There we go. And there. Okay, so now it's perfectly, according to the computer, it's perfectly straight. That's without adjustment. You'll see it leans slightly over to the left. And there it's supposedly perfectly straight. Okay, and that's this image more or less done. You'll see, I think the biggest, get it nice and big. Okay, the biggest difference is just that extra pop and extra vibrance that it has to the colors. It's got a lot more depth.
Eugene,
The colors just look a little bit more.
We just got white squares there. I mean.
Okay. Okay, can you see them now?
No, the whole screen's white.
Oh dear, okay. Okay, just tell me if you can see anything.
Getting back.
Still no?
Yeah, no, still
okay.
no.
Okay, I'm going to just stop the screen share and restart it.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm sharing again. Can you see my screen?
It's just white. We can see the control panel on the right, but it's just white.
How peculiar.
Yeah, very strange.
Okay, I'm going to just stop the screen share again. And it's giving me a couple of different options here. Maybe I can just do that. Are you getting it now?
Yep.
Okay, you're going to see my entire screen now, so I'm just going to do that. Okay, that's better. Okay, we're moving on to our next candidate. Okay, so for this image here, I think this image I would like to try this one out as a black and white just to see what it does. I'm just trying to arrange the screen so I can actually see my own workspace. There we go. All right. I think this image may actually work quite nicely as a black and white, but we'll see as we go along. We'll see what kind of thing what we get out of it. I'm going to start off again as we did before. I think the white balance looks fine. We can just try and use this white PVC pipe to do the white balance on. I think that does make the image a hint warmer than I would like it. So I'm going to just back off and give it a little bit of blue back again. I'm going to just pull back on the exposure a touch as well. You'll see some of the highlights are starting to lose a little bit of detail. So I'm going to pull back on the exposure a touch, give it a hint of extra contrast. I think in this instance, we can go really pull back on the highlights quite a lot. It brings back a great deal of texture into the sides of the building here and into the clothing, which I think is necessary for this image. Lift the shadows a little and then give it a bit of extra white. I do think I'm going to add a bit of exposure back again. And then what I want to do just to start off with is just see if a low vibrance image like so, or if a completely desaturated image works best. I think completely desaturated might actually be quite nice for this image. So with this one, I'm going to follow a slightly different sequence of events to what I've done for the previous lot of images. I think this image, one of the probably the most prominent kind of design element in the photograph is the building at the back, and you're kind of photographing straight into the building. It's a very flat view of the building, and I want that to be a kind of a prominent defining element of the image, where it creates a nice backdrop for the figures in the front. So I'm going to use a different approach, and I'm actually going to start by making sure that that building is nice and straight and a nice big solid structure in the frame. So I'm going to put one guided transform line along the roof line and another one along the floor. Now, I don't think this building's built perfectly straight, so it's probably going to be straighter in the image than it is in real life. But what it is going to do is it's going to just give the image a nice kind of rigid balance. And I'm also going to use a couple of vertical guides to make sure that it's nice and straight in all its aspects. Okay. Looking at that now, it does still seem to, and I think this is probably because the building is a little skew, it does still seem to taper down to the side. So I'm just going to adjust the one guide. There we go. Adjust both the guides until it looks nice and straight. I'm kind of cheating a little bit, but it gets me to where I need to be. Right. And then you'll see one of the ladies, her feet are getting chopped off. So we can just use the offset, this one, just to shuffle the image a little bit. We'll fix that white corner in a minute. So either we chop her feet off completely, like so, or we just go just under her feet, like that. Okay, and then we're going to do a crop. I want to get rid of the umbrella. Just put the crop right there. I'm putting the crop through the middle of the window pane. I don't want to put it right on the edge. It's going to look a little awkward. I also don't want to put it right on this line. It's also going to look awkward. So I'm rather putting it straight through the middle of that window pane. I'm going to keep the second building on the left. And there is our crop. Now for this image, if we're going to do a black and white, I'm going to need to select a black and white profile firstly. So it's just doing the normal Adobe monochrome black and white profile. And then I can use the black and white tab to adjust the brightness of the individual colors. In this case, I feel that the sky is going a little too dark because the hill at the back is very dark, the tree at the back is very dark, and it makes the whole top half of the image kind of uniformly dark, and we don't really have separation between tree and sky and the hill. So I'm going to brighten up the blues a little bit just to separate the sky from the tree. That there looks quite good. And then I'm going to brighten up the reds a little bit because that will give a little bit of extra luminosity to the skin tones. So we're just going to push those reds and perhaps the oranges as well. And you can see the skin tones just get a nice bit of extra brightness and luminance. The image has more of a kind of a shiny, sunny kind of feel to it. And then looking at this overall tonality that we've got at the moment, you'll see the black and white adjustment. If I just go back in my history here, when I did the black and white adjustments, that was without any black and white color adjustments, and that is with. You'll see it makes quite a big difference to the overall brightness of the image. So this sometimes necessitates us going back to the basic panel and just tweaking some of those tones a tiny bit. In this case, we now have a slightly awkward little corner at the bottom here, but I do think that because it's not too detailed an area, I do think our little spot removal brush might actually do a decent job there. No, it doesn't want to go over the edge. Okay, so this would then unfortunately have to be a Photoshop fix, or we can just go back to our transform controls, and I'm going to use the horizontal aspect option here and just tilt the image over in that direction. And you'll see that it kind of stretches one side of the image and squeezes the other side until those two sides balance nicely. And that kind of gets us to where we want to be. So there's our before and our after. I think the black and white has a nice classic look, which won't date as easily as the color version. You'll see the shape of the building looks really, really different. It seems like a more solid background in this image than it does in the color version. Okay. Right. Any questions up to this point? Is everyone
Eugene,
happy and following along? Yeah.
can I just ask you about the enhanced details, which is fairly new in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw? Is it worth doing? Does it have a major effect, or it's obviously in the library panel and yeah?
It's extremely image dependent, and I haven't worked with it a great deal because I find the results to be a little inconsistent between different images and also between different cameras. I find that on the Fuji cameras it works beautifully.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Oh yeah, on the Fuji cameras it works beautifully, but I've tried it on a couple of Canon 5D files, 5D Mark III and 5D Mark IV files, and it's a little hit and miss. I think where there's real value in fiddling around with that and seeing what you can get out of it is when you are intending to make a large print.
Okay.
So, and by large I mean properly large. Like if you're working with an entry level, say Canon SLR or mirrorless camera, those cameras are already 18 megapixels, and that means you can comfortably print A3 with just the detail that the sensor captures. So unless you're printing A2 or larger, I don't think there's a real benefit to using that, because because the effect only really becomes apparent in a larger sort of print. It looks beautiful when you zoom in on screen and you see the extra detail. Yeah. But it's kind of pointless if you're not printing that detail.
Okay, thank you.
Can you just, Eugene, show people where that is? The enhanced details.
I don't even know where it is actually.
So if you right click on the image,
it's also at the top.
I haven't used it that much. It's just, you'll see in this image that's enhanced. I'm just going to zoom out a little so you can actually see something.
Yeah, it's almost kind of hard to see it, but
it's such a subtle difference. And I think that the reason it works very well with the Fuji cameras is because they have that kind of worm-like artifacting that you get sometimes.
Yes.
And this function tends to smooth that out to some degree.
Yeah.
But with that, with most of the other cameras, I just, I don't really see that much value in it unless you're pushing the limits of how large you want to print with from your files.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Very, very good question. Please keep the questions coming. Okay. So our lot of Bokkums over here. Okay, so when I see a file like this, I really actually do get quite happy because if you look at the histogram really does stretch the entire range of the image, and the overall brightness of the image looks a hint brighter than correctly exposed. And that makes me happy because that means I can fiddle around quite a lot without having to worry about introducing noise to the image or any of those sorts of horrible, nasty things. First thing I'm going to do is just straighten the image. So I'm going to press R on my keyboard, and I'm going to click this angle thing here, and I'm going to just straighten the horizon. And that gives us a nice tilt to get everything nice and straight. I'm going to shift the crop so that these two poles are similarly far away from the edges of the frame. And I'm going to bring the crop in so that it sits right through that beam at the top. I don't want a little piece of sky peeking out at the top here. And if I'm going to have sky, I want a lot of it, not just a little piece peeking out. So that gives me a nice kind of tight framing for the image. What I like about not having the sky at the top is it really forces the eye into the pattern of the bokums. The composition does end up feeling a little bit cramped, but I think, you know, that's a matter of perspective. The compression of your lens, or of your point of view rather, at this point does already create a little bit of overlap, and that's perfectly fine. But I do like to kind of force the viewer into this area where all this beautiful texture and pattern is sitting. So this image overall, I think, is definitely a little on the bright side. So I'm going to pull the exposure back a bit, and I'm mostly paying attention to the side of the boat. If I just reset that, at the side of the boat here, the color seems really, really, really washed out, and the lighter part of the fish skins also lacks texture. So what I'm looking at is really those two areas. I want to see the color coming back into the side of the boat, and I want to see those fish skins picking up a little bit of extra texture. And that's basically what we're getting at about this stage. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of contrast. In this case, more for the sake of picking out a little bit of texture detail than anything else. We'll fiddle with the texture slider later as well. The highlights, I think, look fine at the moment, but I would like to bring a little bit of extra density into these lighter tones just in the bottom section of the sky. So I'm going to pull back on there a little. I'm going to give it quite a generous nudge of shadows. I want to try to bring out a bit more of the detail over here. That's actually too aggressive. I'm going to back off, and I'll rather do that with a local adjustment, because what's happening when I push the shadows too far, the shadow on the bottom of the boat starts disappearing, and it makes the boat look quite flat. So I'd rather actually go the opposite way with the shadows, keep this very prominent rounding on the boat, and then I'll deal with the fish separately. I'm going to push the whites up a little bit just for that pop of contrast, and pull the blacks down to make sure we maintain a good ratio of contrast in the shadow tones. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, not too much. Let's say 1 to 3 should be enough. There we go, because I want to have a look at the fishy textures and the textures that paint on the boat. And I'm going to nudge my texture slider a bit just to see what we can get out of it. You can see the effect on the boat is very noticeable. That's without, and that's with. The effect on the fish is not quite as noticeable. So we're going to maybe just do that, and then I'll add it back locally on the fish again later. This image, I think, will also, because it's kind of a rustic looking scene, will probably look nice with a softer rendition of color, not completely desaturated, just a little bit more muted. So I'm going to pull back on vibrance a little bit, just over there. So thus far, that's how far we've come with the image. You'll see the boat appears beautifully three-dimensional. The fish, the lighter part of the fish is very beautifully detailed. The dark parts are, however, not as nice as the original one. So that's where we need to do a little bit of extra work. The way I'm going to do this one is with a radial filter, the little round one. And I'm going to just make a really long, because it's kind of a generally oval-shaped, flat oval-shaped area where I want to work. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to adjust it to set it to adjust the insides. Now you'll see this exposure adjustment brings a lot of extra brightness in there, but I do think it's making the lighter parts of the fish a little too light. So I'm rather going to adjust shadows. See, it looks a little bit more natural. Do a very subtle increase to the exposure, and then pull the blacks down to make sure that we get still enough contrast in there. And then, like we were saying before, I'm going to zoom in a little, and I'm going to put the texture slider to a slightly higher value. I'm just trying to get the scales and the texture on the sides of the fish to come out a bit more. And I'm going to support that texture slider by giving it a little bit of clarity as well. The clarity tends to be far more aggressive and work on larger structures, but it does define kind of the fish body shapes a bit better. Okay, let's say done. And there we go. So And if we go before and after, now we've got a beautiful brightness coming through in the bodies of the fish over there. Okay. Next thing I want to do with this particular image is I'm going to go and visit my hue, saturation, and luminance panel again. Under luminance, I just want to darken the blues a touch. I do think these bright blue areas at the top are becoming a little bit distracting. And I like that the shapes at the top here mimic the shapes in the scrapes of the paint, but I do think they're a touch too light. So I want to just pull back on the luminance of the blues and the aquas, because they tend to work together, and then pull back on the saturation of both. Otherwise, because when we pull the luminance down, the saturation tends to increase a little bit. You'll see there's a little bit of an imbalance top to bottom in the image now. The bottom half is a little bright in comparison to the top half. So I'm going to introduce a gradient filter from the bottom edge up and just pull back on exposure ever so slightly. Again, it helps to kind of accentuate the rounding of the whole of the boat, but it also stops the bottom edge of the frame from being too bright. So if we do that, that's without the gradient, and that's with it. It kind of holds in the bottom edge of the frame better. And then I just want to have a nice close look here, one-to-one, just see if we've got any kind of, oh yeah, we've got some really rather spectacular chromatic aberration there. So under lens correction, we're going to switch that on. That fixes the chromatic aberration for us. Going to enable the profile correction. Ah, beautifully straightened. See that very prominent barrel distortion. Nice and level and straight and beautiful when you do that. I do think it may be worth, in this case, also just trying to, now when we switch guided transform on, it undoes our crop. So I'm just going to reset the crop and then redo the guided transform first. So I'm going to just use the guided transform and straighten out these two poles. The reason I want to straighten them is because they are leaning at different angles, and because they're so close to the edge of the frame that the difference in the angle at which they're leaning is really obvious. So I want to use the guided transform just to make sure that we've got a nice rigid grid shape for our image. Sorry, I'm just clicking on the wrong things here. I'm going to reduce the scale a bit, because when we reduce the scale, we can bring the bottom edge of the boat back into the photograph, and we're going to shift the image side to side with the offsets a little bit, just to there we go. All right, so before and after. Okay, questions? Any questions? Nope. Right. Okay, this image over here. I think something like this is, I actually want to stay very, very close to the original rendition of the image. I think the main thing I would like to do is just to keep the silhouettes really prominent. And that means keeping the blacks black, but just lifting the brightness of the surrounding areas a little bit. And in this case, surrounding areas is mostly going to be confined to the bottom part of the image because the sky looks beautiful. I don't want to change that too much. What I am going to do, just to add a little bit of extra color contrast to the image, is I'm going to shift the white balance a little bit colder. The reason I want to go colder is I want the blues to be more prominent. But because these oranges and reds in this image are so vibrant, even if I do make it quite a bit colder, I'm not going to compromise on the oranges too much. So I can get, you'll see if I go colder there, the oranges stay pretty much just as orange as they were, but we get a little bit more vibrance in the blue. And that really is just all I was looking for. I am going to lift the overall brightness of the exposure a tiny bit. You'll see we start very quickly when I adjust this, we start losing a little bit of the definition in the cloud. So I'm going to make a tiny adjustment there. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to pull back on the shadows a little bit, keep them dark, and on the blacks. I'm going to keep my Alt key in when I pull back on the blacks, and that way I can see where it's going pitch black. So anything that's showing up on the screen now is pitch black. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to do a gradient, a very short one in this instance. I'm going to do the gradient literally just there, just like so. I'm going to just hide that, the actual gradient indicator, just so it's not too obvious. And I'm going to lift a bit of the shadow detail, a little bit of the contrast, and a little bit of the whites in the foreground, just to try and bring out the brightness in the water a bit, and to make the separation between the silhouette and the brighter areas more prominent. And I think I'm also going to go a little bit warmer in the foreground and a little bit pinker, like so. All right, so before and after thus far, we're just bringing out that little bit of extra blue. We're giving it a little bit of extra pop of color in the foreground, and we're accentuating the differences between those contrasting colors. Then next thing I'd like to do is just nudge the tone curve a little bit. This image, it's all about the color, it's all about the contrast, and making sure that this middle part of the tonal range, the middle part of the tone curve, is nice and steep. That will allow all of that contrast to translate beautifully. So I'm going to do something along those lines. And this particular rendition is kind of very reminiscent of what you would get on a high contrast slide film like Fuji Velvia. It looks very much like what you would get on those sorts of films, and I think it actually suits the image quite nicely. What I'd also like to do is just under hue, saturation, and luminance, I'm going to go into luminance and just darken the blues ever so slightly. In this case, darkening them again does increase the saturation a little bit, but it also allows the prominence of the clouds to remain really obvious in the image, and that I think looks quite nice and vibrant. I could very well imagine myself lounging on one of those boats. Okay.
Eugene?
Yes.
Could you just go over those gradients? Sometimes you pull them sort of long and wide, and other times narrow.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what it does?
Okay, so let me just, sorry? Okay, I'm going to just use this image as an example because it's a very uniformly toned image, top to bottom, but it also has a distinct horizon line. So I think, the gradients are an incredibly versatile tool as long as you apply them with care. And I think the two things you mentioned earlier, you mentioned, Kim, is sometimes I make them very long and other times I make them really short. And what's the difference? Why would I do one or the other? And that really just has to do with which areas I intend to change, which areas I want to adjust. So, for instance, with this image we've got over here, if I have a general imbalance, if the bottom kind of area in general is a little too bright or a little too dark, whichever, and the top part is there's just too much of a difference between the two, then I want to make a big kind of general, fairly subtle change. So let's say, for instance, I'm going to make a minus adjustment. It's not going to look nice on this image, but it will illustrate. So I'm going to make quite an aggressive minus adjustment. So let's say I want to kind of make an adjustment that very gradually fades from one side of the image or from one half of the image to the other. Then I might start right at the top edge and drag all the way down to the bottom edge. So I can't really, and what that means is you can see when we do when we look at the pins, the top line is over here and the bottom line is over there.
Yeah.
What that means is that it fades so gradually, it's actually very difficult to tell that you've done anything. In this case, the adjustment is aggressive enough that we can see it. But this is the longer you make the gradient, the more subtle the effect is, and the easier it is to disguise what you've done. When we go and make it really short, like so, now you can see if I just position it there and I just make it really short, like that. Now I'm just essentially adjusting the sky. If I overdo it, it makes a really obvious line. So when I make it this short, it's much more difficult to disguise what I'm doing. You know, if I make it bright like that, you can kind of get away with it. But as soon as I start making it darker, it's obvious that I'm working over here. So it really is just about it's about defining the area that you want to work on. If it's a very specific area, just the sky, then we make the gradient really short. And if it's a very general adjustment, then we make a long, gentle, smooth gradient.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Good. Right. Very good question. Keep them coming. Okay. So we're going to leave that one as it is for now. And we're going to come back to these boats over here. Right. Cool. So I am going to just again start with a bit of a straighten, like so. And I kind of get the sense this image needs a bit of a crop, but we'll leave that for a bit later. Looking at the histogram over on this side, you'll see over in this image, most of the tone in the histogram is kind of stuck on the bottom, in the bottom 2/3. The top third of the histogram is completely empty. And that's kind of a general indication that the exposure is a little bit on the dark side. So we are going to need to nudge that up a little bit. In this case, it's not such a big issue where I would be concerned about noise. You are shooting at 400 ISO, so when we do brighten things up, we may run into a little bit of trouble. And when I look on the inside of the boat here, you can see there is a bit of noise. So we do need to treat it with care so that we don't end up creating a whole lot of noise that we may not have wanted. I think with this one, we're going to go for quite an aggressive edit. The staggering of the line of boats here I find quite striking. And I think this image, because the color in the image isn't particularly vibrant, it's not really doing a great deal to add to the image. I think I'm probably going to go for a black and white edit on this one. I'm going to start off by just getting it up to kind of what I would consider a correct exposure, around about here. Just zoom in again, you'll see the noise in the foreground in the boats become a little bit more obvious, but it's not catastrophic. I'm going to give it a bit of extra contrast. In fact, I'm going to give it quite a generous nudge of extra contrast. Just pull back on the highlights a little bit. I'm going to leave the shadows alone. I'm going to give it a bit of extra whites and pull back on the blacks. So now I've just established, where's that color come from, I wonder? Oh, I didn't reset this one before I started fiddling with it. That's where the color came from. So when we look at the image like this, you can see that, I just want to look at my edits. So that's the reset, that's where we were. That's the starting point, and this is where we are now. So you'll see it's looking a little bit more punchy, a little bit more detailed, and all those sorts of things. And at this point, we are now going to come over here to the profile picker, and I'm going to go to Adobe Monochrome. That is kind of the black and white equivalent of the Adobe Color, obviously, and it gives me a relatively flat black and white rendition. This image, I think, because it's got a lot of kind of finer textures and things in it, in the water and in the stones and so on, I'm going to give it just a hint of extra clarity. I want those textures to come out nicely. You'll see the sand in the front actually looks quite nice when we push the clarity up a little bit. And I think that kind of gets us a decent sort of starting point. I think the tone curve is going to be really important to what we end up doing with this image. But before I get to the tone curve, I want to deal with the sky. The boats are quite sort of solid, blocky, heavy, dark shapes. And the sky is very soft and luminous and bright. And I think those two things are slightly at odds with one another. I think that to get that nice gritty hard look that I have in mind, I do think I'm going to need to darken the sky quite significantly, and I'm also going to need to tweak the balance between sky and foreground compositionally. So I'm going to go for a squarer crop than this one. I'm going to select a 4:5 aspect ratio, and I'm going to position it just over there. The sky is, the horizon's quite close to the middle of the frame. It doesn't really bother me. I do want to keep, a decent amount of sky while also showing some of this beautiful texture in the sand in the foreground. So that's going to be our new composition. I'm going to go to my gradient filter, and I'm going to do, I think I'm probably going to do 2 gradients on this one over the sky. So we're going to do one big one running from the top edge of the sky to the horizon. That's going to kind of just give us a general gradation running across the whole of the sky. And I'm going to go down with exposure a little bit, up with contrast. I think what I want to show you quickly, when I do that, see, it makes a very, very obvious line in the sky. So I'm actually going to run that gradient into the foreground a little bit, just like so. I think that might actually work a bit better, just disguise it a bit more. I'm also going to push the whites up a little bit and give it a bit of extra clarity in the sky. You'll see it brings out the cloud shapes quite beautifully when we give it a bit of extra clarity. Okay, and what I'm looking for more or less is a similar brightness at the bottom edge of the frame and at the top edge. So you see the bottom edge of the sand over here is quite similar in brightness to the top edge. And what that does for us is it kind of frames the midsection quite nicely. So now we've got like a nice third over here, we've got a nice middle third, and we've got a nice kind of bottom section to the frame as well. You'll see that's without the gradient and with. I'm going to do a second quite short gradient just there. And I'm going to reset everything. And this one is just going to be for a hint of extra clarity. Just there, extra contrast. Okay, so that's no gradients. With the gradients, we get a nice pop to the sky. Okay, so what's happened now is because I've darkened those really prominent highlights in the sky, and the image has now gone back to looking a little bit flat. But this is where the tone curve is going to come in to help us quite a lot. I'm going to pull up on the upper section of the tone curve, and immediately you'll see the image gets a great deal of extra luminosity to it. And I'm going to just pull back on the bottom section as well. You'll see that when I do this curve adjustment, because it's changing the contrast so aggressively, it's also making my gradient at the top far more obvious. So what I am going to need to do is just come back to the gradient quickly and just make it slightly less aggressive. I'm going to move it down a touch. That will disguise it as well, because then there's a longer section here that's actually dark, so it's not so obvious. And we go there. Okay, so there we've now got a lovely punchy kind of contrast result. I do think the image can also benefit from a slight vignette. So I'm going to just pull the vignette, the amount down a little bit. I'm going to put the midpoint to the right. That means the vignette doesn't come into the center of the image quite as much. And then I'm going to feather it just to make sure that the vignette is really soft and very, very gentle. That's without the vignette, and that's with. I think I'm going to back off on that vignette a little. That's without and with. There we go. Right, and then the last thing I want to do to kind of stick with, or not maybe the last, we may do one extra thing, to stick with the kind of the black and white gritty nostalgic look that we've created here, I'm actually going to add a bit of grain to the image. So rather than trying to remove the noise that we've got here, I'm actually going to disguise it by hiding it behind some grain. So I'm going to just pull the grain slider over to the right. It takes a second or two to render the grain. There we go. And I'm going to make the grain quite heavy and gritty. Okay, so that's without the grain and with. It does still look a little bit like noise. I think it looks really, really nice in the sky. There we go. And then maybe the last thing I'd like to try is just a split tone. I want to use a very, very gentle, warm, cold split tone. So holding Alt on my keyboard, I'm selecting a color. I'm going to go for kind of like a apricot tan, like that, for the highlights. Just introduce a little bit of that. And then I'm going to go for a really cold, kind of electric blue for the shadows, just over here. Just introduce a little bit of that. And I'm going to bias towards the highlight color. So you'll see that's without split tone and with. And there is our before and after. Right, cool. Any questions?
I like what you did there, Eugene.
Yes,
You transformed that.
Yeah. That's the lovely thing about a raw files. You can do all kinds of wonderful things to them. Really mess around with them. I think as we go along, I think I'm going to try a few more. We've done a couple of nice basic ones now. I think I am going to try a couple of more aggressive edits. One thing I want to try is we've got these two images. I assume it's the same person and shot at the same place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the second one with the same adjustments that I did to the first one, and then just tweak it until it works. So to do that, I'm selecting both, and I'm just going to say sync settings, and I'm going to sync everything, including the gradients, but not including the crop. So I say synchronize, and you'll see immediately this image has already come quite a long way. I think the first thing I'm going to want to do to this one is just make sure the horizon is nice and straight. There we go. Cool. And then this one's going to need a slightly different treatment for its gradient filters. This one, I think we need a much shorter, more aggressive sort of gradient over the top. So let's see what this one is doing. This one, this gradient, I'm actually going to flip upside down and put it on the bottom edge of the picture, so that again I can kind of use it to frame the boats in the middle. It's like so. Pull back on the exposure a little bit over there. Also pull back on the exposure a little bit over here. And you'll see that lovely, this patch of brightness across the middle here is working beautifully to kind of frame the boats. The one thing I'm a little concerned about is that if we look at the left-hand edge of the picture and the right-hand edge, there's a big inconsistency in brightness. This side obviously a lot brighter than that side. We've got two options: either we brighten this side or we darken that side. I'm going to go with brightening on this side because brightening it is going to keep the boat shapes really, really prominent, that duplication of the boat shape. If I darken on this side, then we're only really accentuating the central couple of boats. And then that repetitive pattern is going to get lost a little bit. So I'm going to make a nice long gradient that goes kind of 2/3 of the way across the image like that, and just push a little bit of extra exposure into there. And that again, you'll see no gradients with the gradients. Makes a big, big difference to how this image reads. And then with this one, I think the one thing I do want to tweak a little bit is just what's happening in the highlights here. When we zoom in, we see there's some beautiful sparkles on the water, but our edit at the moment isn't making them obvious. So what I'm going to do is pull back on the highlights, and you'll see what happens is this tone here darkens, like so, and then push up on the whites. That's going to lift the sparkles a little bit, and that just gives us, I can just go back between those two steps. That's without, That's with it. It's not making a massive difference, but it is making the little sparkles on the water stand out a tiny bit more. Now, a nice little trick we can apply here as well is, let's say, for instance, we want to present these two images as a set, you know, two images that go together. And if I look at them like this, I actually think, see, let's click that one. I actually think this one is working a touch better than that one. So what I want to do is I want to get the left-hand image resembling the right-hand image a bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on this image, and I'm going to say, where is that? Set as reference photo. Then I'm going to take the image I want to edit and go to the develop panel with it, and I'm going to toggle on at the bottom left here the reference view. Okay, got it. So now I can see this image for reference while I'm fiddling with that one. And I think the main change we're going to just need to do here is just go slightly more aggressive with our curve adjustment. And you'll see now when we do this, immediately that plus a little bit of an extra nudge on the whites, and now the two images match more closely. And the main difference between them now is this one, the vignettes are way more obvious than on that one. So I'm going to just come back to this one and make the vignette a bit stronger. And now if we view them side by side like so, they match somewhat better. Okay, questions, comments?
Yeah, I've got one, Eugene, and maybe to Kim and Leslie. As soon as one uses the split toning, it's not judged as monochrome any longer. Is that right?
That's a moot question, actually. I'm not 100%.
Yeah, no, it's not monochrome anymore. You've got more than
two different colors.
Yeah,
then two different hues, then it would not be monochrome.
No.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
But that's purely from a competitional thing and a PSSA thing if you're entering salon. So, but from a purely artistic point of view, it's fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so for our little beach scene over here, looking at this one, I think it's got slightly too little contrast to work as a black and white, but we can maybe try that as well. The one very obvious thing that I'm noting is an extremely strong pincushion distortion that's happening over there. So that is kind of an obvious place to start with this one. So I'm just going to switch the lens corrections on just to straighten that out a little bit. We're also going to give it a bit of a crop. Like so, just to, I'm going to take a little bit of that space at the bottom off, and we're going to straighten it nicely. So now we've got, I think, a decently balanced composition to work with. I think I am going to try to make a black and white version of this image. Not sure how well it's going to work. I think the contrast is maybe a bit on the low side. So we're going to start it as a black and white. And I think in this case, what I want to do is keep quite a bright sort of rendition. I'm going to make my basic adjustments here just to keep the image in general a little bit on the brighter side, and to make sure that the contrast is reasonably strong. And I'm going to give it a hint of clarity. In this case, I'm going to be super gentle with the clarity because it's got so much grass and things in it. These are the kinds of subjects that just tend to look excessively gritty when we're too aggressive with the clarity. So I'm going to just be quite gentle with the clarity there. I think in this case as well, we're going to need to use the gradients quite extensively just to make sure that we keep, because there's a lovely flow through the bottom of the composition where the composition runs along this line and then into the sand and out into that breaking wave over there. So I'm going to use quite a lot of local adjustments just to maintain those accents. So I'm going to, again, just start at the top, give it a gentle gradation across the sky, just because the sky is quite flat. and I want to give the sky just a little bit of, I don't want to call it interest, but I just don't want it to look too flat. And in this case, you can see where I actually can't see where in some places I can't see where the sky starts and my background ends. So I'm just going to right click. I don't want to do that now. I'm going to change my background color to dark gray, then we can see better. There we go, that's much better. And then we're going to add a couple of additional gradients. So this foreground grass, I think, is looking quite busy. So I'm going to put in a gradient across there. I'm going to reduce the contrast and reduce the exposure, just to kind of subdue the grass a little bit. And I'm going to do the same gradient again across, like so, like that, and again across, like so. So those three gradients are all taking care of this foreground grass. You'll see that's without, and then it's very easy for the eye to linger in the brighter detail at the front here. But when we do that, immediately we go over the grass and we start looking at the sand over here. We now need to balance what the grass is doing over on this side over there. So I'm going to put a radial filter just across that little patch of grass. And oopsie, I just want to adjust the inside, not the outside. Invert, thank you. Also, again, reduce exposure, reduce contrast, just flatten that grass out a little bit. And I'm going to right click on here and say duplicate. I'm going to take the duplicate and I'm going to put it onto this little patch of vegetation over here. So, something like that. And just increase the feathering just so it's nice and subtle. And I'm going to duplicate that one again and stick it over there. So I can essentially just use the same adjustment multiple times, and in each case it's just doing sort of a different version of the same thing. The main area that's now still bothering me is this kind of edge on the left-hand side of the frame. I'm going to try and see what happens if we just put a gradient across like that. I'm a bit concerned that it's going to mess with the sky. No, it does mess with the sky quite a lot, so we're just going to have to go and brush that out. No, actually we're going to not do that. We're going to just make another nice circular gradient. So it's like so. I'm going to adjust the inside. I'm going to pull way back on the highlights and down on the feathering a little bit. There we go. And that sort of subdues that corner for us a bit. So if you look without the radial gradients and with. Then to accentuate this beautiful splashing wave at the top over here, I'm going to put a radial gradient over that as well. I'm going to make sure I adjust the inside. I'm going to push the whites up and I'm going to put the clarity up. And the combination of those two really picks out the white water and the spray in the top half of the image over there. So thus far, we've come from the sunny looking image to that over there. I think this image will benefit from a crop as well. I'm going to take quite a bit of space off the left, just again to try and keep the emphasis in the middle. So I'm going to go for a squarer aspect ratio like so, and just position my crop over there. There we go. That I think looks quite nice to start off with. I'm going to again just tweak the tone curve a little bit just to give it a nice bit of punch in its overall tonality, like that. And I'm going to come just back to my gradient of the sky here and just maybe put it a touch higher and darken it a touch more, just like so. There we go. And then we can go and do some more subtle adjustments when we come to black and white here. I'm going to pull the greens down a little bit. That will, that's aqua, sorry, greens. There we go. That will flatten the grass out a bit more and help us to keep the emphasis in the sand. I'm also going to darken the blues just to keep the sky and the blue of the sea a bit darker, and that allows the water spray to stand out more prominently. Okay, this image I think will look nice on a black backdrop. There we go. Cool. All right, so that's that one. Moving swiftly along. Again, interrupt at any point if you have questions, just shout out and I will happily address them. All right, with this image, I'm going to stick to a color rendition. I want to make it quite soft and pastel. I'm going to just start off by brightening the exposure a touch, and I'm going to just cool down the white balance a little bit. Give it a touch of extra magenta. This sand over here was looking quite green, so I'm just giving it a bit of extra magenta. I want the warmth to come out over here, and I want to get rid of the green that I was seeing over in this area over here. Okay. Right, I just want to see how far can we go with this one. Right. I'm going to go for quite a bright, luminous version of this image. I'm going to go for a lower sort of contrast. I'm going to pull back on the highlights a little bit. I want to make sure that I maintain detail in these very, very bright highlights. The shadows I'm going to probably leave alone. Maybe just pull them back a touch, just for the sake of, you can see the detail, the depth in the leaves becomes more prominent when I pull back on the shadows. And I think just a hint of blacks as well. Right, we're going to do a gentle gradient running across the top. I just want to hold it in a touch, not so it's obvious, just a very subtle darkening along the top edge of the photograph so that we can keep the emphasis on this lovely patch of light that's running across the dune in the middle over here. What I am also going to do is, and this is, this is not generally the kind of thing I want to do in Lightroom, because Lightroom is a bit of a fiddly platform to do this. But the leaves here are really, really beautiful, but I do find the bits of dried kelp that are sticking out to be quite distracting. So I'm going to, not do what I've just done. I'm going to use my little healing brush, and one by one, just try to tidy up the kelp a little bit. Fortunately, because they're kind of, that looks like that guy can go as well. Here we go. Just because they're kind of positioned kind of loose in the sand and they're not surrounded by too much else, it's fortunately relatively easy to tidy them up. But Photoshop would definitely be better suited to this sort of task. These ones over here in the middle are going to be more difficult to deal with because they're a little bit closer to other detail elements. Okay, there we go. Right, spot of gardening done. A couple of other loose little spots here. Okay, I think that's going to do the trick. Okay, so that's just a little bit tidier. You can see the marks here and there. I can see a little mark over there, a little one over there, and a little one over there. So that's, yeah, if we were a bit more careful, we could probably deal with that reasonably well. But yeah, because this is Lightroom, it's not perfectly suited to this sort of task. I am going to lift just the tone curve overall. We were talking about a pastel sort of rendition earlier. I want to lift the overall brightness of the image just to get it to go a bit softer. And I'm going to pull back on the vibrance a touch. I just want that very, very subtle, soft kind of green of the leaves to show through nice and gently. And that, I think, is, yeah, I think it's obviously a matter of taste, but I think quite a nice, gentle, soft rendition of this image actually suits the subject matter quite nicely.
I think it looks lovely like that. Very minimalistic.
Yeah, I also like that one, what you've done with it.
Yeah, I think very often what happens is we have some kind of preconceptions about what we think an image should look like. And sometimes if you do something that's kind of technically a bit iffy, this is technically a bit iffy because it's really bright and kind of luminous and it looks a bit overexposed, but it actually works quite nicely. So sometimes we just need to take a little bit of a risk with it and see what it does. What I would maybe want to consider with an image like this one as well is I'm just going to make a virtual copy of it. And in the virtual copy, I'm going to go black and white and just see what it does if we do a slightly harder rendition in black and white. That might also actually work in an interesting sort of way. For black and white, if we're doing a black and white, I do think we are going to need to be a little bit more heavy-handed with our gradient filter. I'm going to just give that one an extra nudge. But something like this, you know, it's very often a good exercise to try and make several different versions of an image just to see which rendition suits it better. I prefer the color one, but the black and white one I think also has some beautiful textures going for it. Okay, next up is the boat. Okay, so I'm going to just, as before, start with just double check that it's nice and straight. This unfortunately is. I'm going to actually darken it a touch because just see what happens to the color in the boat and in the water and into these textures. See what happens when I go a bit darker. There's just a lot more prominence that comes into those sorts of areas. I'm also going to just pull back on the highlights a little bit, give it a little bit of extra nudge in the shadows. You can see we're lacking a bit of detail on the top of that pole. So I want to bring that back up again. Just give it a bit more. Just give it a bit more. Nice, there we go. Right, give it a pop of white, just see how this white shape, the front of the boat, how that pops out the moment we push the whites up. And then just to make sure that we keep a nice solid contrast foundation, I'm going to go way down on the blacks. And that immediately just kind of gives the difference is quite subtle. You almost have to go looking for it, but the image immediately has a lot of extra depth, and all of the lovely textures both in the movement of the boat and in the poles are, all of that's nicely accentuated. I'm going to give it a small kind of nudge of clarity as well. This one's also going to need a little bit of a gradient treatment. You can see that the left-hand side of the image way brighter than the right-hand side. Again, we've got two options. We can go brighter on the right or darker on the left. And you know, without actually doing it, we're never not going to know what works best. So I'm going to start off by just seeing what it does when I go brighter on the right. I do actually quite like that. It's a bit soft and gentle and quite luminous. Makes me think of a nice bright sun-bleached day, and you can see there's a lot of extra detail and color that we're getting out of that building there. The building actually looks way nicer this way around. So that's the one option. Our other option, I'm just going to undo that one. I'm going to remove that one. Our other option is to just go the opposite way around and to darken, like so. I think the darkening option is, it seems like the more obvious way to go for me, but I don't think it looks as nice as when we brighten the left. So I'm just going to go back in my history and we're going to actually go with that version where it's a bit brighter. We are going to need to do a little bit of extra fiddling. So I'm going to do an additional gradient from the corner in like so. So like a little adjustable vignette over there, and I'm going to give it a friend on the other side to do the same job, and I'm going to go quite aggressive over the top just to hold in the top edge of the frame quite nicely and just bring a bit of extra definition into those clouds that we've got there with a bit of extra contrast and a bit of extra clarity. I'm actually going to come well into the bottom half of the picture and I'm going to use the range mask again so that I can remove that adjustment just from those posts and from the building. I don't want to compromise the detail that we've got in there. Okay, so there we go. So now you can see we're darkening the sky quite a lot, but it's not really having an impact on the top of those posts. I'm going to say done. This image I think can do with a nudge of extra color. I'm going to give it quite general extra bit of vibrance. I think the blues and these green cyan greens actually look beautiful. I don't want to oversaturate them because they're going to start looking very artificial if I do that. But I am going to go to hue, saturation, and luminance and just push up the saturation with the yellows, reds, and oranges so that we get a bit more out of the boat and out of the posts and out of this lovely warm light that we're seeing across the middle of the image here. And that, I think I just want to go back to this. I think this one is a little bit too heavy now. I just want to ease up a bit over there. And this one as well, just ease up a touch on that adjustment. And then just see this one maybe needs to come a little bit further over to the right. Right, cool, done. There we go, before and after. Again, I think quite a notable transformation. And again, I think this is another image where I would want to go and just make a virtual copy of it. I would want to go and make a black and white version with that virtual copy and just give it quite an aggressive sort of contrast treatment. Just like so. I think it goes quite graphic when we do that. And you'll see the two images are, just very, very, very different moods out of the same thing. So depending on what your intention is, you can get some really different results just with a small adjustment like that. Okay. Then shoot with your questions if you have them. I'm going to work just a little bit more quickly now. This image has a much softer tonality than the other one. It doesn't have the direct sunlight. It just has a kind of a softer, gentler feel overall. So I'm going to give it a very different process. I think this image, to me, is almost screaming out for a higher key sort of rendition. So I'm going to just go a little colder on the white balance and a little bit more magenta because it does have a noticeable green tint. There we go. And I'm going to go for quite a bright, higher key sort of look. I'm going to let the highlights go quite bright.
Okay, where are they?
Mute the shadows a little bit. Keep those shadows quite dark and muted. I don't want the blacks to be too black. I don't want it to be heavy. I think the image needs to be quite soft. So I'm actually going to lift the blacks a little bit just to make sure that these areas over here don't go too heavy. So let's see, how far can we push this one? There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. There we go. Right. So at the moment, what's happening for me is the overall brightness in the image is actually working beautifully, but the color of the ropes is becoming quite distracting. We've got a lovely graphic sort of flowing line running through here, but the fact that it's green and orange, I think, is actually bothering me a bit. And similarly, the color of the building at the back is, I don't think it's really adding anything to the image. I think it's just distracting. So we're going to go to black and white with this one as well. There we go. Immediately, I think, it transforms into something quite different. I just want to get rid of this. I keep trying to wipe it off with my finger, and then I realize it's not on my screen, it's on the picture. I'm just going to do that. And we're going to do this. Just to tidy up those two little thingies. And I think we are going to tidy away this one as well. There we go. Okay, and then my next little thing, what I want to do, I am going to use a gradient from the bottom up. I actually want to brighten the bottom part of the image a bit so that it kind of flows up and almost bleeds into the horizon. I want that transition to be much more subtle. There There we go. It's quite aggressive with that. And then overall, I'm going to lift the upper part of the curve. Basically what I'm trying to do is this section over here, the section that's kind of 90% of the photograph, the light tones. I want that part of the curve to be quite flat, because the flatter that part of the curve is, the less contrast we have in these highlights, and the more that kind of smooth look that we've tried to create becomes accentuated. I don't want to do the traditional S curve here because I think it's going to add too much contrast, but I do want to pin down these shadows so they don't change too much. And I really think that's pretty much all this image needs. I don't think it needs anything else. Okay, cool. This one would probably also look, it would be an interesting one to experiment with a bit of a split tone. So maybe we can just try that very quickly. Split tone, I think a general orangey kind of tone would actually be quite nice. But I'm not going to add a color to the shadows. I'm going to leave the shadows alone, and I'm going to limit this color mostly into the highlights. So you'll see the shadow tones, the darker tones remain very, very neutral, but we're getting a nice bit of warmth in the lighter tones. I think it might actually look cool with a colder one as well. No, doesn't work. There we go. I'm going to select my color. There we go, just that little bit of warmth. That's without, looks a touch sterile, but with the extra warmth, I think it just has a bit more depth to it. Cool, right. Next image, Venice, right, cool. All right, so for this one, my first kind of protocol with an image like this is just to make sure that it's nice and straight, to do the transform corrections first. And the reason I want to do the transform corrections before I do anything else is because sometimes it distorts the image so much that it forces me to do some of the other corrections I want to do in a slightly different way. So by doing the distortion, fixing the distortion first, I'm not duplicating other efforts. And I'm going to do 2 vertical lines, or horizontal lines rather, like that. I'm going to do 2 verticals like so. And now we've got a nice upright building, seemingly upright. Seems upright, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. I think this one is slightly skewed. There we go. That's better. Right. Okay. Now, back to my basic panel. I'm going to give it, the sky is quite bright, but most of the rest of the image is quite dark. So I'm going to give it quite a bit of extra exposure and quite a bit of extra contrast, because the foreground, all the buildings in the foreground, all of that is in quite flat, very even light. So I do want to nudge the contrast a bit. I'm going to pull well down on the highlights. We're going to need to do a bit of extra work to the sky in a minute. But I'm going to pull way down on the highlights. At the moment, the highlights really is only influencing the sky. None of the rest of the building is really being adjusted by that. I'm going to give it a bit of extra shadow. And I wonder if I overdo the shadows, I can pull back on overall exposure a bit. And that does help me with the sky. So if I push the shadows up, I can pull the exposure down a touch, and that means there's less work to do to the sky. A bit of extra whites and a nice little bit of punch to the blacks. I'm going to give it a hint of clarity, in this case mostly because of the brickwork. I think the brickwork's really beautiful, and a bit of extra clarity and a little bit of extra texture is going to help us to accentuate the beautiful textures in the brickwork. And I'm going to give it a generous nudge of vibrance. I want these greens in the water and these russet colors in the bricks to stick out quite a lot more. Next thing for us is a gradient again across the sky. I'm going to pull the general exposure down and the highlights way, way, way down. And you'll see in this case, it's obviously having a noticeable kind of effect along the top of the building, which we don't really want. So we're going to need to apply a luminance range mask again. And again, I just use my Alt key to help me to define which areas do and which areas don't get influenced by that gradient. I think I've been a little too aggressive now. There we go. That's a bit better. Okay. And then another option we have for dealing with the sky is we can also go to HSL. We can select luminance and we can pull back on blues because that's obviously what we've got most of in the top here. Let's pull back on blues and that mutes the sky for us a little bit further. If we look in closely here, we don't see any significant fringing. We are seeing a little bit of chromatic aberration there. We'll fix that quickly. Fix the profiles. There we go, nice and straight. I am going to undo the vignetting correction a bit because I do actually like what that was doing. So I'm going to go back to basic. I'm just going to give it a bit of extra saturation. I think those, I often associate quite vibrant colors with Venice, so giving it a nice bit of extra saturation there I think is not going to go amiss. And then just a very gentle S-curve like so. And then we're in, I think, quite good shape with this image. We've come quite a long way if we compare the two like that. And maybe perhaps just as an added bonus, we'll quickly do a virtual copy, set it to black and white. In fact, in this instance, I'm going to use one of the other profiles, which is going to allow me just to darken the sky a little bit more and brighten up the bricks. So the red filter option here is going to make that possible for me. And I think that's also, you know, it's very much a matter of preference which one we're going to go for, but it does give you two quite contrasting renditions of the image to consider to use. Okay, right. So these two images are very, very similar, and I think whatever goes for one goes for the other. I find this one of the two, I think this one's nicer because it's got this beautiful accent in the foreground. So I'm going to just reset that gradient that I did before. An image like this one, I think, again, there's not a great deal of color in it, so we could consider it as a black and white. So maybe we'll just, again, go and do a couple of variants of it. What I'd like to do in making my general adjustments is I'm just trying to accentuate this beautiful patch of light that we've got across the foreground here, like so. So I'm holding back the left-hand side of the right-hand side of the image just so it's not too bright here. Then my eye can linger in that area. I'm also going to just add, not necessarily darken the sky so much as adding a bit of contrast just to bring more depth into those beautiful, beautiful clouds you've got there. And then also just, I think in this case, because most of the interest is on the right-hand side of the image, I'm actually very tempted to make it into a square frame because that kind of allows me to accommodate all of these interesting flowing lines in the sand without the kind of empty space that we've got on left. I think that actually works really beautiful. It's got a lovely kind of stacked perspective. It reminds me very much of the work of the British landscape photographer Charlie Waite. He photographs a lot of stuff with a very stacked patterned perspective like this. So something like that might be quite an interesting rendition. And just perhaps a virtual copy again. And in this case, we're going to go black and white. And we're going to just see what we can get out of our adjustments here. I just want to try to accentuate those bright lines, but it's not working as well as I hoped it would. Let's go back, see if there's a better option for us in the curve. I don't think the black and white is working. I think we can remove that. We can delete that virtual copy. Yes. And I think in this instance, we're just going to stick with the color version. I think that looks really rather beautiful. And what we can then do is synchronize all the settings except for the crop to the other image. Take the other image into the develop panel as well. Give it a touch of extra brightness because it is a slightly darker exposure than the previous image. And I think it might make a beautiful pair if we crop both of them in a similar sort of way. So this one's going to need a bit less sky than the other one, than it has now. There we go. Now when we put the two next to each other, they actually complement each other quite nicely. We may need to just go and tweak. I'm going to set this one as the reference. I'm going to develop. Okay, so what I want to do is just get the sand in this image to resemble the sand in that image. So basically, I'm just going to tweak the color a bit. So we're going to go to hue, saturation, luminance, under hue. Let's try saturation first. Actually, I'm going to pull back on the oranges and yellow a bit. That gets the hue about right for the saturation, and then we're going to darken the hue a touch. Now they resemble each other a bit more. As well, down a little. And then for this one, we're also going to need to just take out a bit of saturation from the blue and shift the blue over to the cyan side a little. Right, there we go. A reasonably good match between the two. Cool. Any questions, any comments so far?
Not on this too, but I'm very impressed with what you did with my boats and my building that I couldn't get upright.
Yeah, well, buildings are stubborn like that. Okay, so yeah, we're running a little bit long on time, so I'm going to just kind of try to be a little bit quicker. And this image, I think it's all about the silhouette. I don't mind seeing a bit of detail in the sand in the front, but I do think these two figures and the camels definitely need to be really, really rich black against, I think, a slightly brighter sky. So we're going to push a bit of extra brightness into the sky there. I'm going to go a touch colder on it. We'll tweak the color a bit in a minute. I'm going to push the whites up and the blacks down and see what we can do with the shadows. Actually, I think I'm going to leave the foreground quite dark, and then maybe we just crop a little bit off the bottom of the image just so it's such less bottom heavy. I think there's maybe a little too much sand at the moment, like so. Bit of extra clarity gives us a lot more. You can see the top third of the clouds there, beautiful extra definition coming through when we give it a bit of extra clarity. I think we're going to enhance that dark mood from the clouds a bit more by going even darker and even more contrasty in the sky. We're also going to put a radial gradient around the camels where we're going to adjust the inside. And in this case, I'm just lifting the whites quite significantly to accentuate this patch of brightness that we've got behind the camels to make the silhouette stand out a bit more. Like that. And then I think we can maybe just push the saturation up a little bit. Just there. I don't want it to go kind of like a candy yellow, but I do want a little bit of extra saturation coming through there. So this image, I think all the ingredients are there, all the composition's beautiful. There's not really a great deal we need to change. It's just allowing that beautiful silhouette to read nicely by bringing a bit of extra contrast into that area as all the image needs. And you'll see there's a great deal more depth in the clouds now that we've added quite a lot of contrast in there. Okay. All right. Okay, so this one, Just see what we've got here. Okay, yeah, this one I think is quite a tricky one because we've got a difficult situation to deal with these headdresses that are so bright. And I'm kind of, I kind of feel that it's going to be next to impossible for us to bring detail back in any way that's going to look realistic there. If we pull back on the exposure, you can see there's a tiny bit of detail there, but not very much. And we can't get it out without compromising a lot of the other details in the image. So I think we can maybe afford to go a touch darker, give it a bit more contrast. And rather than trying to bring out detail in the headdresses, I'm going to try and bring accent to the forms of the three figures that are standing there. And that means just keeping the difference between their outlines and the surrounds quite distinct. I think this, you know, it's a nighttime image. It's very moody. It's very dark, and I do actually want to go with a dark and moody sort of result, sort of overall look. There we go. Now we're getting a nice bit of contrast out of there. I do want to stick to a darker and moodier overall kind of look because that's, you know, those are the raw ingredients we have to work with. Ideally, an image like this would do a round trip to Photoshop just so we can tidy out these little patches of flare. I'm not going to try to do that in here. I think it's going to be nearly impossible to get it to look realistic. I am also going to just give it a manual little swivel to try and get it straight. There we go. I also think the image can perhaps do with a touch less color. So I'm going to mute the vibrance a little bit. And I'm going to give it just push the curve, the tone curve down a little bit. Again, just for the sake of keeping those figures nice and prominent. And you'll see now what's happening. This part of the curve is closer to horizontal. It means we've got kind of flatter blacks. It depresses the detail in these blacks. And then we've got a steeper section at the top here. And that means we've got a lovely amount of contrast in all of the highlight areas, which is where all of those accents are that we're trying to bring out. And I think that gives the image a nice bit of punch. It's the haziness that's in the original we can kind of remove a little bit. There may be something worth looking at just with these streaks of light, but I don't think Lightroom is the right place to try and bring them out. But it is possible, I think, if we were working in the right kind of platform, maybe in Photoshop or so, we can perhaps accentuate those streaks of light in a realistic sort of way. It's working here, but it's not as effective as I think it might be in Photoshop. It's not bad. Oh, there we go. That's without and with. Not bad at all, actually. Better than I expected. Okay, then we can maybe just push that exposure there. There we go. All right. So there are our three brightly headdressed figures. Nice. Okay. Questions, comments? No? Another camel. Right. Shall we do this camel? I think this camel is going to need a slightly different rendition from the other one. The other one has a very dramatic contrast to start off with. This one is still silhouetted, but in a much more subtle sort of way. So again, I'm going to try to keep the silhouette quite prominent, but to put it in more of a kind of a general kind of pastel toned image. So to keep the tones fairly pastel, I'm putting the exposure up a little bit, and I'm going to drop the contrast a little bit. I am going to lift the highlight brightness just to give the image a bit of extra luminance, but I'm going to also lift the shadows just a tiny bit, just until before it starts adjusting the camels. Push the lights up a bit and then pull back on the blacks a touch. I think what may be a worthwhile exercise in this instance is going back to our brush again, switching on the auto mask. I'm going to show the mask, switch the mask overlay on so that I can see where it's brushing. So I'm going to just brush the camel and the two little figures And just for the sake of allowing me to pull down on the black tones on them a little bit, just to keep them quite aggressively silhouetted, because there's not a great deal of detail in them anyway, so we might as well just let them remain black, especially because they're so small in the frame. That then allows me to kind of push the other tones a little bit more. And the tone curve, I'm going to give it a little bit of extra contrast, and I'm going to reduce the brightness of the sky a little bit. There we go. Lovely camel silhouette. I think these two images again make a lovely pair. I want to see what this one looks like before and after. Yeah, again, I think it's a subtle sort of difference. We can perhaps try with this image just to go slightly warmer, just to allow those orange, those very gentle yellow tones in the cloud to come out a bit more. So I'm going to go a hint warmer on the white balance, and a bit of extra vibrance and a bit of extra saturation. And that kind of gives it more of that kind of warm, deserty sort of feel. I think what's really lovely now is these colors that we're starting to see there and there, and these little accents in the clouds that are becoming a bit more prominent. Cool. Nice. Quite like that. Right. This image has quite a challenging tonal range. I think in this case, I just want to see sort of what kind of tones we have to work with. I'm quite tempted to go for a relatively bright rendition here. And the reason for that is if we go darker, what happens is there's a very sudden transition between blowout and not blown out. But if we go bright, the two kind of fade into one another. And it almost, even though there's more blowout, it's less obvious because it's less clearly distinguishable from the areas that are not blown out. So I'm going to give it a generous amount of extra exposure. I do find the person's kind of crimson shirt is a little bit distracting from the expressions which is where I think the attention needs to go. So I think because of that, more than anything else, I'm going to go for a black and white version on this image, because what that's also going to allow me to do is also going to allow me to darken the shirt a bit. I'm going to keep increasing, doing a lot of adjustments that allow me to increase the contrast of the image. So you'll see all of my basic adjustments here. I've increased the contrast, I've increased the highlight brightness, I've darkened the blacks, and all of those are contributing to a more contrasty, more punchy sort of image. And what I think is happening now is, because of the extra contrast, the flow of the line of the arms leading up into the horse's face becomes accentuated quite nicely. To accentuate that even further, I am going to push the curve up a little bit. And you can see we've got a huge amount of blowout at the back here now, but what that's doing is it's actually delineating the figures beautifully, rather than creating this block at the back, which can be quite distracting. I'm just going to go to black and white as well, under the black and white mix, and just darken that shirt. You can see that holds, because what's happening now is if the tonality is like this with the shirt quite bright, then the horse's head, because it's so dark, makes the image seem very heavy on the right. So by darkening the shirt, the two elements balance one another slightly better. Cool.
Eugene, I like what you've done there. It's changed it totally. The only thing is being quite harsh on the man's skin. Yeah,
it does kind of make his skin a little bit more ruddy looking.
Yeah.
And that's also because of the adjustment to the reds here, because most of that texture that I'm bringing out by doing that is actually the red detail. But what we can do to compensate for that is we can use our brush And what I'm going to do with the brush is I'm going to make an adjustment with reduced contrast, reduced texture, and reduced clarity. I'm going to auto mask it again, and then we can just kind of brush it in like that. I'm just using this mask overlay just so I can kind of see what I'm doing more or less.
Yeah.
And then we'll go back to it later. I think the arm maybe we need to get as well. Ideally, we would be a little bit more careful than I'm being now.
Yes, but you've got to be quicker.
Just doing a quick job here. So now we can switch the overlay off, and you'll see when I pull that contrast out, immediately smooths his skin quite a lot. So there, that's without the adjustment. So if you want him to look old and weathered, you can do that. Or you can do that if you want him to look a little bit more youthful.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what we could do is, some patches haven't worked as well as others, so we could do an additional brush over the areas where we haven't been able to mute the effect quite so well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right. Okay, so we've got a little sculpture here. I think in this case, I'm kind of leaning towards the idea of a higher key black and white sort of rendition again. I just want to, before we try that, I just want to see what there is available in the sky. There is a bit of detail there. I think for me, the tricky thing about processing this image is both the brightness and the color of the figure is very similar to the background. So creating separation between the two, I think, is going to be our big challenge. And I think it's going to be a little easier to do that in black and white than in color. But I'm going to start off by just doing my normal adjustments, my normal basic sort of adjustments in color first, just to see what we can get out of the image in terms of overall tonality and so on. That does not look, I think, too bad. But I do think that, I don't think the color, again, like we've seen with some of the other examples, I don't think the color is really contributing very much to the image. So I'm rather going to go black and white. And my strategy here, I'm going to see if I can make it look a little bit infrareddish. So I'm going to lift the brightness of the foliage quite a lot, right up to the point where it's almost starting to look a little bit artificial. And I'm going to pull back on the blues in the sky a bit. And then to kind of accentuate that higher key, slightly infrareddish sort of aesthetic, we're also going to give it a fairly generous amount of extra contrast. Just there. I'm a little concerned about this highlight detail in the sky. So what I'm going to just try to do there is just pull a little bit of highlight detail back and a little bit of exposure back, just so we don't lose all of the texture out of the sky. Like that. I do think there's a bit of an odd balance because of the tree we've got on the right hand side over here. So we're going to, I think, just trim a touch like so. Keep the figure nice and full. Oh no, it's too tight. Okay, I think we're going to have to compromise and just keep a little bit of the tree. I'm just going to keep a little bit of the tree like that. Doesn't work. We're going to have to keep more of the tree. Backtrack a bit more. There we go, that I think we can get away with. I'm also going to just put a small gradient across the side here just to separate the figure from that edge of the background a bit better. And I'm going to put an additional gradient running from right to left just to balance the two halves of the image nicely. There we go. Cool. Right, I think it's I think the original image is is suffering a little bit from low contrast. I think the lighting is just really, really flat. And I think the only way to kind of overcome that is to go black and white, because if we were to do this sort of processing in color, it would look very, very, very unnatural. I just want to show you quickly. If we go back to color, it just looks quite artificial. It looks very heavily processed. Whereas the black and white is also heavily processed, but I think it's easier to get away with it if we don't have the distraction of the color looking unnatural at the same time. Okay. And this is our last candidate, a rather ungainly looking spoonbill. All right. I think with this one, my biggest concern here is just what's going on with these feathers. So I just want to firstly just pull back the exposure in general just to see what there is. And it does look like we've got enough detail in the feathers, so I don't need to worry about that too much. I'm going to start off by chopping off this. I assume it's a duck. So yeah, I'm going to chop that off just to tidy up that edge of the frame. Another thing that's slightly odd about this image is that it's got a very, it's almost like it's split between the green section over here and the brown section over there. So I don't know how we're going to work around that. That's perhaps not a Lightroom job, but you may be able to do something to it. I'm going to start off by just establishing a nice bit of detail in the feathers. The light's also quite flat, so I'm going to give it a bit of extra contrast. And you'll see as we darken the image and we add a bit of contrast, a lot more detail and depth shows up in the feathers of the bird and in its body shape. All right, cool. So that gives us a reasonable start. We can see there's a nice bit of extra detail, nice bit of extra contrast that's come through there. It does look a touch cold, so I'm going to give it a hint of extra warmth in the white balance, and perhaps just give it a bit of texture just to see if that helps with the feathers a bit. I'm worried about the extra texture maybe possibly making the background look too busy, but that's the reason I'm using texture and not clarity. If we use clarity, you'll see the background starts looking really gritty, but if you use texture, we can get a bit of extra detail out of the feathers without doing too much to the background. What I would like to try is just see if we can get this background color to be a little bit more uniform, and there's room for a bit of maneuvering here. I want to see what happens. Maybe if we take the greens and we shift them over to kind of a more orangey kind of color, maybe we can get them to match the rest of the scene. Kind of works, looks very artificial. Or we can go the other way around, and I'm actually going to use the targeted adjustment tool where I can click on the image and to define which colors I want to work on. And just shift those colors over a little bit to green. So maybe do that. Shift these ones a bit the other way. Okay. It's not perfect. That as opposed to that. Oopsie. That's before. That's after. I think it just matches the background color overall a little bit better. And I'm going to use my gradient. You can see there, if we use a low clarity gradient, it kind of mutes the background a bit, makes it look a little bit less busy. So I'm going to keep the gradient, the clarity a bit lower there, and just bring this gradient across to keep the right-hand side of the image a bit darker. I'm going to use the range mask again just to get it to exclude the bird from that edit as well. So luminance, and I'm going to, the bird will be really easy to exclude because it's so much brighter than everything else. And just something along those lines. There we go. So there we've got, without our adjustment and with, I think we can maybe make this gradient, just bring it across a little more. There we go. Right. So that I think is a notable improvement on that image. I think, yeah, I think it would definitely benefit from a little bit of kind of love in maybe in Photoshop just to try to soften some of those details along the top as well. but I don't think it's an essential kind of thing. I'm going to just darken the top bit as well. Just hold in that top edge of the frame. There we go. That's better. All right. So that is our full batch of images. Does anyone have any general questions or any comments, anything you would like to know or ask or find out that I could perhaps pitch in with?
That was a marathon session.
Yeah.
But it was fantastic. Thank you.
I'm very glad if you find it useful.
Yes, thank you, Eugene.
Yeah, no, you're very, very welcome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Can you, won't you just make a screenshot of that and send it to me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can do that. I can definitely do that for you. Yeah, and then if so this was, I think, just obviously a really quick run through.
Yes.
More just to give everyone a sort of a rough idea of how to go about things and what you can and what you can do with a fairly quick poke around in Lightroom. But if anyone needs any, if anyone needs any additional kind of pointing in specific directions, feel free to get in touch.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's very incredible what Lightroom is able to achieve fairly easily.
Yeah.
But I do think it would be great if people wanted to do a course later on in the year when we're able to.
Yeah. Yeah. So just on that note, we are busy at the Cape Town School of Photography. We are busy structuring a whole lot of new online courses. None of them are running yet. The first courses will be Photoshop running it on the 22nd of next month. But Lightroom will be, it's kind of next in the pipeline. So, and we do one-on-ones and we can do bespoke courses as well if anyone's interested. So yeah, feel free to get in touch.
Well, thank you. That was superb. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the best to everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.